find the number 3 throughout the natural world. As a people, we are fascinated with groupings of 3. But it's the presence of this 3-note grouping we call the triad that makes the experience of Western music so profound.
Hi, this is Dr. Kurt Sander. Welcome back to Music Theory. Much of the music that we listen to and love is made up of 3-note chords that we call triads. Now, we can think of a triad as simply 2/3 stacked on top of each other, and they come in many different forms. But what is it about the triad that sounds so good to our ears? And how do we tell the difference from one triad to another?
Most people believe that our love for the triad comes from the science of acoustics, where every note, whether played on an instrument or sung, contains overtones that form a triad.
But what really is a triad? What's it made of, and how do we know one when we see it?
Any triad, regardless of how it's positioned on the staff, will always have 3 elements: a root, a third, and a fifth. Now, these terms come from the intervallic makeup of the chord when it's in its most compressed form. For example, between the C and the G here, we have the interval of a fifth, and between the C and the E, we have the interval of a third. To make things a little bit easy for you, I'm going to assign colors to the various aspects of the triad. That way, you can keep track of what's what. For example, roots will always be red, thirds will always be green, and fifths will always be blue.
Identifying triads is not a hard process when they're in their most compressed form. All you have to do is look for a line, 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 or a space, space, space configuration.
So in looking at this first chord, we can see that it is indeed a triad because it has a space, space, space configuration. This chord is also considered a triad because it has a line, line, line configuration. This chord, however, is not a triad because we have 2 lines and a space.
Well, life would be pretty easy if triads always came in their most compressed format and in root position. But we know in looking at music that that's not always the case.
Things get just a bit tricky when we understand that triads come in a variety of spacings and configurations. Now, this first triad should look familiar. It's a line, line, line configuration. But we might have a harder time identifying the second and third chord as triads, partly because of how they're spaced out, or because some notes are doubled, like the C in this particular chord. But if we took the time to analyze the pitch content of each of these chords, we would find that they all have a root, C, they all have a third, E, and they all have a fifth, G. So even though they look different on the page, because their pitch content is the same, we can consider them triads built off the note C.
Of course, the process becomes even more complicated when we deal with notes that are in more than one staff, like in a piano piece or a choral score. So what's the process we have to follow in order to determine whether a chord is a triad or not? It begins with a process we call stacking thirds. And trust me, if you do this enough, eventually you can do this in your head. But let's do it together so that you can understand how the process works.
So the first thing to remember is that for any chord to be considered a triad, you should be able to reposition the notes to achieve a line, 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 or space, space, space configuration. And then, when the notes are in their most compressed format, you can identify what the root is, the third is, and the fifth is, based on their position in the 3-note chord. Let's try an example. Here we have a 4-note chord, something a choir might be singing. And what we're going to try to do is reposition the notes to create a line, 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 or space, space, space configuration. And what we're going to do is we're going to start with the bottom note, which is an A. And we're going to see if we indeed can stack thirds on top of that A to create a triad. Now, to make it convenient, I've added an extra staff over here on the right side to keep track of my notes. So I'm first going to move my A up to that second space on the treble clef, which is also an A. Now I'm going to look a third above that note. That note is a C. So I'm going to look at my chord to see if I have a C. And there it is. Now I will look a third above the C to see if I have an E. So I go back to my chord, and indeed I do have an E. When triads exist as 4-note chords, we can expect that one of the notes is going to be doubled. And sure enough, our remaining note is an A, which just so happens to be the root of our A triad. Let's try one more to make sure you have this. Here we have another chord, 4 pitches, and this is again something a choir might sing. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move all of these notes so that we can see its most compressed format. And that again is line, 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 space, space, space. So we're going to start with the low F here, and we're going to move that all the way over to the treble clef staff here. Then we're going to look a third above, and that note is A. Do we have an A? Yes, there it is. We'll move that one over. And then above that, we have a C. So we're going to be looking for a C, and there it is in the alto voice, and we're going to move that over. And our remaining note is the doubled note, the F. And so we can see now that moving these notes over, we have an F triad. And again, we're making a space, space, space configuration on this treble clef that we've added over here.
So now you get the process of stacking thirds and how it can help us identify the root, the third, and the fifth of any given triad. And while the process may be slow at first, over time, I assure you, it will get easier. And eventually, it's my hope that you don't need that extra staff and you can do this process in your head. Now we're ready to move on to the next step, but here's where it gets just a little bit tricky. Once we've been able to stack thirds to identify the root, the third, and the fifth of any triad we come across, now we have to be able to identify the quality of the triad. You see, triads come in 4 different qualities based on their intervallic content.
So in Western music, there are 4 main triads. The 2 most common are major and minor. Then there's the diminished, which is a little bit less common. And then not common at all is the augmented triad. And you can see that each triad has a different intervallic content.
Now there are many different ways to go about memorizing the differences of triads, but over the years of teaching I found that one method really helps students differentiate one triad from another. And it requires a kind of unusual image, a snowman.
In looking at the major and minor triads, for example, we can see that they're composed of 2 stacked thirds. The lowest third of a major triad is a major third, and the lowest third of a minor triad is a minor third. Inversely, the upper third in a major triad is a minor third, and the upper third of a minor triad is a major third. Now when you stack a major third on top of a minor third, you get the interval of a perfect fifth. So both of these triads are a perfect fifth high, so to speak.
So what does all this have to do with snowmen?
Well, if we were to imagine that each of these intervals were circles, major thirds being large circles and minor thirds being small circles, we could, if we used our imagination, imagine that each triad was a snowman. And of course, the first snowman is happy. His body is proportionate. The second snowman, unfortunately, is sad. Perhaps he has a headache. The point here is not to be silly or cute, but actually to provide you a pedagogical tool for remembering the intervallic content of major and minor triads. Now, of course, in real music, not all major chords are happy and not all minor chords are sad. Nevertheless, this does give us a tool for remembering the intervallic content of these two chords.
So before we move on to talk about diminished and augmented triads, let's work with the major and minor triads a little bit. Let's take a look at a triad and see if we can figure out the intervallic content of the thirds and determine the quality.
So here's where all of your hard work in studying intervals pays off, because you really need to know your thirds in order to figure out the quality of triads. So if we look at the lowest two notes, the D to an F, we have to ask ourselves, is this a major third or a minor third? Now you can say, well, I know that D to F is 3 half steps on the piano, thus it's a minor third. Or I can momentarily think in the key of the lowest note. If you recall from an earlier lecture, we can recognize major intervals by simply thinking in the key of the lowest note. If this were a major third, we would expect to find an F sharp because the key signature of D also has an F sharp. But since it's not, we know it's a half step lower and thus it's a minor third, not a major third. Now let's repeat the process with the upper third. Again, we're going to momentarily think in the key of F, which is the lowest note, and when we look at the key signature, we can see that A, the third above, is indeed in the key of F, so it is a major third. So when we find a small minor third with a large major third on top, it reminds us of that snowman with a headache, the sad snowman. And again, by extension, that should remind us that this is a minor triad. Let's do one more to make sure you have it. Here we have a new triad. And again, we're going to look at the bottom two notes and think in the key of the lowest note, which is E. E major, as we know, has a key signature of 4 sharps. Now the question is whether the note a third above that is in the key. And yes, it is. We can see that G sharp right here. So if we remember that major keys have major intervals, we know that this is indeed a major third. And again, we're going to do the same thing between the G sharp and the B. But in this example, there is no such key as G sharp major. So let's count half steps instead. Starting with G sharp to the A is 1 half step. A to the A sharp is 2 half steps. A sharp to B, 3 half steps. And as we know, 3 semitones, 3 half steps is a minor third. So again, we look at this configuration. A major third with a minor third on top, it reminds us of our fully proportionate, happy major triad snowman.
So for now, I just want you to work on distinguishing major and minor triads. The next time we meet, we'll look at diminished triads and augmented triads, and then we'll take a look at how triads can be in inversion, which means the root is not necessarily in the lowest voice. But I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today's lesson. This is Dr. Sander, and until next time, take care.
we find the number 3 throughout the natural world.